It stands 2-2 between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley. So after the second match, this means that we are moving on to Blitz. And who will be the champion and who will win? That remains to be seen. So today we will take a look at the first Blitz game between Wesley and Magnus Carlsen. A very thrilling and exciting game. Absolutely great stuff. Incredible stuff. So let's take a look. E4. C6 from Magnus. He once again goes for Karakan, which is apparently an opening that he had prepared before the match. He also did play this in the first game out of the second match, as I did already analyze. So everything is the same here. D5, E5, bishop F5, knight F3, this time from Wesley. So he changes things up. He does not play the knight D2, knight F3 line. This time he goes for the more common knight F3, bishop E2, and castle setup, which is indeed a popular approach and certainly not a dumb one. Black needs to be careful. There is a lot of theory. Let's see how the world champion responded to this. So, alright, E6, bishop E2. Once again, we have this H6 move. As I have already mentioned in the other video, the point of this is that we want to put the bishop on H7. So, another idea here is to play G5, as I also mentioned in the other video. But for example, knight E7, knight G6, bishop E7, knight D7, also potentially C5. You could even play C5 and knight C6 as well. A lot of different ways to go. White's plan is different. He wants to play on the king side with F4, G4, and perhaps even F5 later, and go for an attack. So let's see how this went. Castles, knight E7. Wesley decides to take space with A4. I think that is certainly an interesting way to go. Magnus answers with A5, knight D2, knight D7, knight B3. So he once again puts his knight on B3. He likes to have his knight there, potentially play knight D4, and he also gets some more cover on C5. Very similar to the previous game at this time. Just one of the differences is that Magnus did not play bishop b4 here early. He also did not play queen b6. So there are a few minor differences, but all in all, it is fairly similar to what we saw last time. Especially after the next moves here. Bishop h7, bishop d2, queen b6. Already, it is slightly similar, but it is different because there is no c3. Which means that this knight is not really weak. We do not have to protect that knight any longer. And not only that, one important thing is that we do have some attack against the pawn on a5, which does mean that in the future I can also put my queen on e1 and then put even more pressure on a5. I just got to make sure I protect the c2 pawn, which is attacked by the bishop here. h3, typical move that you make in order to kind of wait to see what black does, because it's not that easy to find a move for black here. c5 is not something you want to do. I can simply take, and bishop e5, and this is very nice for white. For example, bishop e3 and knight d4, and the position, black's position is already falling apart. So something like that would not be too great. One of the problems that black do have is that he's simply not very developed. So he goes for knight g6. He wants to put the bishop on e7, perhaps on b4 as well. Queen e1. And the only way to prevent the pawn from being taken is to play bishop e4. Another thing you should now keep in mind is that now that the knight stands on g6, the pawn on c2 is no longer hanging. So queen e1, bishop e4, bishop takes, queen takes, queen takes, a takes. Let's investigate further. Bishop d3 by Wesley, he puts his bishop in this diagonal. c5. As surprised, I must admit, but Magnus is counting on that he does get enough play against the pawn on e5. So if I do take on c5, I can then take on e5, and this is very good for black, very solid. But I think he has underestimated a little bit that I can take with the knight here instead, which means knight takes, d takes. Then everything looks fine, doesn't it? After rook a5. But Wesley has seen longer. He has seen longer, and after bishop e5 check, king e7, rook e1, we do want to put more protection on the pawn on e5. So rook c8, and everything seems fine. Have I now been able to save myself? I actually haven't, because Wesley finds this great move, c3. Knight d4 is another good move, with the idea of knight b3. Just throwing that out there. But c3, b takes c3, and here the brilliant move, b4. Look at this great pawn chain right here, a4, b4, and c5. And now it's looking awfully lost for the world champion with these pawns marching down the board. It's not looking very great. And he needs to find a way to get counterplay against these pawns, because it will be too late. This pawn is going to fall. I can simply play rook c1 and take it. And the bishop here is perfectly placed, protecting the pawn on a4. So this is not looking good for Magnus. So rook e8, rook c1, attacking the pawn, knight f4, trying to put some counterplay here. Rook takes c3, bishop e4. Remember that this is a blitz game, so things went down incredibly fast. a5, f6, trying to get more counterplay, attacking at the center a little bit. h4. Not so sure what the purpose of that move is, but I think Wesley wants to play g3 and get rid of that knight. Remember that the rook on c3 protects the knight on f3. So g5, Magnus grabs some more space. g3, knight g6. Things are going back and forth here. You can see that the evaluation bar is jumping up and down. The position is completely winning for Wesley according to the computers, but this is blitz where everything can happen, and it's not so simple as it may seem. The advantage is +5, which is absolutely ridiculous compared to the position we do have. This is by all means not completely over. E takes f6, king takes f6, h takes g5, and this is kind of an inaccuracy. You do not want to open up the h file here. Things could turn potentially slightly dangerous. So I'm gonna say that this is a slight inaccuracy. It gives black unnecessary counterplay that you do not want to give black. So instead, h5 would have been the way to go. And after something like knight of fate, you can then play g4. Just completely lock everything. These pawns are very strong. And here, black is really struggling in order to find good moves. Because my plan is knight d2, knight b3, knight d4. Perhaps rook e3 as well to prevent e5. This knight is completely out of the game. Black is completely helpless in this game and dead lost. But after a takes g5, knight h2, things are not looking as good as they were for Wesley. And that is understandable, you know, time trouble, blitz, a lot of things can happen. And things are getting more complicated. The best way to go would actually have been to take the bishops, simply grab the bishop on e4 and then play knight d2. Pretend that nothing has happened. I actually have so much play here that it doesn't matter that I've sacrificed an exchange. I'm going to win the pawn on e4, and I will be doing very well due to these amazing pawns and this great bishop. This is like +4 for white, which is kind of crazy, but I will take and then play knight d6, and I have an overwhelming advantage here. But Wesley doesn't do it. He plays knight h2. And after knight e5, things are a lot more complicated than they were just 2 moves ago. Like after h5, there is no counterplay at all. Remarkable, isn't it? So knight e5, rook e3. My idea now is to play f3, but Magnus sees that and he plays rook h8. Things are not easy any longer. There are a lot of complications here, and white kind of needs to be careful. All of a sudden, there's tactics with potential knight f3 ideas, or rook takes h2, and a lot of things happening here. So Wesley plays f3, and as a matter of fact, this is a huge mistake, which puts the position completely in balance here. And Magnus once again spots the tactic. Rook takes h2, king takes h2, knight takes f3, rook takes f3, bishop takes f3, and things have now turned around completely. The position is now balanced according to the engines. It is a complicated position where everything can happen, and Magnus Carlsen has once again pulled that Houdini and turned things around. when things were completely hopeless, but they're not any longer. C6 from Wesley. This is the principal approach. He's now hoping for an inaccuracy by Magnus. And will he get that inaccuracy? He actually does get that inaccuracy after d4, which is a huge mistake. Magnus Carlsen here has managed to balance things out, but after d4, the position once again is lost for the world champion here. The best way to go would have been to take the pawn, bishop takes c6, and then simply play rook a7. And apparently, it is not easy to push these pawns towards the goal here. If I do play something like rook f1, it can always be met by g4. And this king here is very active. I can play king e5, king d4, and it's not so easy to march with these pawns. I also have rook h7, rook h1 ideas here as well. So maybe not rook f1. Something like king g1 makes sense to not give rook h7 with a tempo. But simply bishop e4, king e5, king d6. Marching with these pawns is very difficult. It will not lead anywhere for Wesley so, and the position is probably going to end in a draw. However, there is a lot of play left. Everything can happen. But after something like rook a1, rook h7, threatening rook h1, white needs to move his rook. We have a perpetual after rook h1, king f2, rook h2. And if I play something like king e3, I'm almost mate after king e5. Black is winning, d4 are coming. So you're forced to go back, and then it's just a draw. So kind of crazy, actually. And this is a way the game could have continued. But Magnus, he misses his chance. He misses his chance with d4. I wonder what he did miss, because this is very natural. But of course, when you are so low on time, everything can happen. Things just go crazy. Crazy stuff happens, and that's what we saw here. Oops. Rook h8. After rook f1, king g1, rook h1, king f2, rook takes f1, bishop takes f1, and I'm sure this is surely what he did miss, because I'm sure he saw this. Well, I'm a genius, because after rook f1, I have rook h8, rook h1, and I can take here. And if I do take with the king, I can take the pawn, b pawn here, and this endgame is a draw. I'm sure that's what Magnus thought, and indeed, that would make some sense. But bishop takes f1 is a great move. And after bishop takes c6, b5, bishop d7, white can simply play a6. B takes. And again, Magnus probably saw that after b6, he could then play bishop c8. There is no problem whatsoever. Maybe there's something even better. I think, yeah, bishop c8 is the only way to go. Bishop g2, I suppose. And then this should also lead to a draw. But the simple b takes a6 is enough to get a winning position for Wesley. Because the thing is, he can now play bishop g2. And you cannot stop this a6 pawn. So d3 is the only way to go. Bishop takes d3, king e5. But unfortunately for Magnus, this endgame here is completely losing. And this pawn goes all the way. This means that Wesley So did beat Magnus Carlsen in the first Blitz game. And Magnus, he had to win the second game. But unfortunately for him, on his birthday and all, it just, he did manage to win. And Wesley So is the champion of the Skilling Open. He wins the first tournament of the second season of the Magnus Carlsen chess tour. Now the champions chess tour. And yeah, very impressive by Wesley, but of course very impressive by Magnus too. He has been playing well. Both of them have been playing well. What a thrilling match. An amazing match. That's all I can say. Things, they went crazy here. Magnus got kind of outplayed, I would say. This c5 move here was very bad. It just didn't work out at all. And Wesley's plan was brilliant with c3 and then b4 later. Better move would have been to maybe play b6 here, something like that, or maybe simply castle. And the position is very good for white after something like a5 and rook a4. It does look very pleasant for white, but I think Magnus would have to try something like that. And after c5 in this sequence right here, this is simply very, very, very good for white. And after b4, white is completely winning. Things changed and Wesley did not play accurately. And after knight e5, the tables, they did turn significantly. And here Magnus had his only chance to then play b takes c6 and then rook a7. Even the computer thinks that d4 is fine when you look at it first, and intuitively it does look quite good, but unfortunately it turns out that the endgame sequence is simply lost for black. This would have been the only chance to hold the game. This is very likely to end in a draw due to all of the counterplay against white's king, and because of that it is probably a draw, but that didn't happen. Magnus Carlsen made the last mistake. Unfortunately for him, that was enough to lose. And well, congratulations to Wesley. So I hope that you've enjoyed my coverage of the games of the day from the Skilling Open. You can be sure that I'll be back sooner or later. So stay tuned for more great content. And as always, I'll see you soon.